It's an absolute honour and a joy to have Professor Gayatri Gopinath here with us today. A virtual queer migration to Cambridge rather than a flesh one, but a pleasure all the same. I'd like to thank CRASSH and the organisers, Jeff, Layla and Tiffany, for inviting me to be chair and discussant today. It's a real privilege. Gayatri, we're really grateful for you taking the time to speak to us, especially given the taxing and exhausting moment we find ourselves in. Gayatri Gopinath is Professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis and the Director of the Centre for the Study of Gender and Sexuality at New York University. She works at the intersection of transnational feminist and queer studies, post-colonial studies and diaspora studies, and is the author of 2 monographs, Impossible Desires, Queer Diasporas in the South Asian Public Cultures, published by Duke University Press in 2005, and Unruly Visions, The Aesthetic Practices of Queer Diaspora, also published by Duke in 2018. She's published numerous essays on gender, sexuality, and queer diasporic cultural production in journals such as the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies, GLQ, Social Text, and Positions. Gayatri's work, highly attentive to affect and queer archives, is itself deeply affecting. Gayatri develops queer methods and theories and curates queer works in a manner that never loses sight of the materiality of the queer body. Her bringing together of issues of migration, race, and sexuality has had great impact on queer scholarship, art, and activism. And those of us working in this field must acknowledge the work of scholars and activists who've paved the way for the very existence of our fields. Gayatri is one such scholar. So many of us working in queer studies, where in some locations and institutions it's now more legitimate as a field than, say, 20 years ago, might on occasion take for granted the time, labour, and energy that went into forming and consolidating this field of knowledge production. To legitimate it as a field of study is an ongoing process. We can't be complacent, but it's a process that's been eased by Gayatri's compelling, theoretically incisive, and both grounded but expansive and capacious work, and her generous mentorship of other queer scholars of colour. Speaking of the ground, as you probably already know and will see, Gayatri is grounded in another sense of being sort of disarmingly down to earth and modest about the impact of her work. So I want to thank you, Gayatri, for all you've done to lay the ground for the very existence of conferences such as this one. Over to you now for your keynote titled Unruly Visions, the Queer Regional Imaginaries of Agha Shahid Ali and Sunil Gupta. Thank you.
Natasha, thank you so much for that incredibly beautiful introduction. That's so generous. I really appreciate it. And I also appreciate you taking the time to have the conversation with me afterwards. So let me just start by saying how honored I am to be giving this lecture. I know how difficult this conference was to organize, and I really want to convey my deep thanks and admiration really for the organizers for pulling this off. For staging it under these conditions and for bringing us all together. So thank you so much to Layla, to Jeffrey, to Tiffany, to Nikki for all their hard work in bringing us together. So I'm also delighted to be giving this talk that's partly on Sunil Gupta, given that there's a retrospective of his work in London right now. And so I hope my work or this talk can be part of a renewed appreciation, appraisal, celebration of his work. And it's important in relation to queer diasporic culture. And, you know, Natasha talked about sort of the ground upon which we all stand. And I think we all owe a debt to Sunil Gupta for the work that he's done for so many decades, really. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, so just give me a minute. So this talk considers the work of 2 contemporary South Asian diasporic artists, the poet Agha Shahid Ali and the photographer Sunil Gupta, within the framework of archive, region, and affect that I've developed in my book, Unruly Visions. I understand the work of Ali and Gupta as emblematic of what I term the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora. These are practices that negotiate the intersection of race, sexuality, and migration in multiple geographic locations. And one of the central arguments I make in the book is that the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora conjure forth what I term a queer regional imaginary. I use this term to refer to both subnational and supranational spaces that are the imagined locus of alternative logics of gender and sexuality. This queer regional imaginary stands in contradistinction to a dominant national imaginary that effaces non-conforming bodies, desires, and affiliations. It also challenges a dominant homonormative imaginary that is predicated on a singular model of sexual formation that can only see queerness in particular bodies and spaces and not in others. And so this is referencing what Layla was talking about, how only certain kinds of queer become legible. So to give this talk a little bit more context, my initial impetus to write about Sunil Gupta and Agha Shahid together came from the fact that in 2018, I was commissioned to actually write about Gupta's work for an anthology on gender and sexuality in contemporary Indian photography. Perhaps surprisingly, I had never written about his work before. And this is despite the fact that, as arguably the most established queer South Asian contemporary artist, his work fits squarely into the rubric of queer diaspora that I articulated in my first book, Impossible Desires. And that's really the basis of Unruly Visions. I know many of you on this call are probably familiar with Gupta's work, but for those of you who are not, Gupta was born and raised in India, and his peripatetic existence has taken him from Delhi to Montreal, to New York, to London, and back to Delhi. Many of his photo works dating back to the 1970s can be read, or misread rather, as a straightforward documentation of queer life in these and other locations. The title of one of Gupta's early photographic series is Towards an Indian Gay Image. And indeed, much of his work revolves around questions of queer representation and visibility in the context of homophobia in India and elsewhere. Thus, while there is something seemingly transparent about locating Gupta's work within the rubric of queer diaspora, my hesitation to write about it sooner stemmed from my initial, admittedly facile reading of it as being overly invested in a visibility model of sexuality that was singularly focused on cosmopolitan, urban, gay male bodies and desire. It was only when I considered Gupta through the framing of region, archive, and affect that I lay out in Unruly Visions that my understanding of his work shifted. More specifically, it was putting Gupta in relation to the poetry of Kashmiri American Agha Shahid, whose work I briefly touch on in Unruly Visions, that allowed me to come to another reading of Gupta's images. I'll also say that I actually returned to the poetry of Agha Shahid in the wake of India's full-scale occupation of Kashmir in summer 2019. His poetry, which has always so poignantly evoked the psychic costs of occupation and militarized violence in Kashmir, takes on an even greater resonance at this moment. So I found myself returning to Ali's poetry at the same time that I was being asked to write about Gupta's work. So on the one hand, this pairing of Ali and Gupta may seem overdetermined, given that they are both queer South Asian diasporic cultural producers. But on the other, this can also seem like a curious pairing. Not only do they work in different mediums, poetry, photography, but Gupta's work has always placed queerness, his own sexuality and those of his subjects, front and center in the frame of his photographs. His reputation is precisely that of a queer artist who documents and reflects on queer lives and communities. Ali, on the other hand, is rarely, if ever, written about in relation to queerness. Sexuality is typically seen as irrelevant to the questions of loss, exile, and migration that are the central themes of his work. Framing Ali and Gupta together and seeing both as instances of the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora pushes us to reconsider each of their works and see them anew. But it also crucially refigures the meanings of both diaspora and queerness in the process, and I'll return to this point at the end of my talk. So placing these figures in conversation, I'm enacting here the method of queer curation I lay out in Unruly Visions. A queer curatorial practice, as I understand it, entails staging collisions and encounters between aesthetic practices that may seem discontinuous or unrelated. These unexpected juxtapositions are crucial in that they reveal not sameness or equivalence, but rather the radical relationality of seemingly disparate social formations, geographies, and temporalities. To read Ali alongside Gupta is to bring to light new meanings to texts we think we already know. This is ultimately the goal of queer curatorial practice. It is a mode of emplacement of viewers, readers, and cultural objects that radically shifts our field of vision so that new possibilities come into view. So let's begin by entering into the work of Kashmiri American poet Agha Ali. Ali understood himself as a triple exile, as he called it. He was compelled to leave Kashmir, first for Delhi, then for the US, where he shuttled between Pennsylvania, Utah, Arizona, and New York before he died of brain cancer in Massachusetts in 2001 at the age of 52. The point of departure in much of Ali's poetry is his exile from the bitterly contested region of Kashmir, which is now, of course, under draconian occupation by the Indian military. Significantly, it is this region, not the nation states of India or Pakistan, that provides the anchor for Ali's diasporic vision and sensibility. Similarly, his sense of Americanness is exquisitely attuned to the contours of region. His poetry evokes the landscapes and layered histories of the US Southwest or Midwest alongside those of Kashmir. In Unruly Visions, I briefly discuss Ali's poem In Search of Evanescence, where I engage it as a broad canvas for the questions of loss and displacement that are Ali's key preoccupations. Here, I want to take the opportunity to revisit and expand my initial reading of Ali in order to see what his linguistic rendering of a queer regional imaginary opens up in relation to Gupta's photographs. In Search of Evanescence is the central poem in Ali's 1991 collection, A Nostalgist Map of America. It is an elegy written at the height of the AIDS epidemic in the late 1980s, addressed to a friend, perhaps lover, who has died of the disease. The collection's title poem, in fact, is dedicated to Ali's dead friend, Philip Paul Orlando. In Search of Evanescence is made up of 11 loosely connected sections that evoke what Ali terms a mythic terrain, one that traverses the superstition mountains of Arizona and the flat expanses of the US Midwest, along with the Karakoram and Hindu Kush mountain ranges of the Himalayas. In an interview a few years before his own untimely death, Ali notes that it was the death of his friend that provided the connective tissue that combined poems that, as he put it, originally had nothing to do with him. Here's an excerpt from the third section of In Search of Evanescence. When on Route 80 in Ohio, I came across an exit to Calcutta. The temptation to write a poem led me past the exit so I could say, India always exists off the turnpikes of America. The warm rains have left many dead on the pavements. The signs to Route 80 all have disappeared. And now the road is a river polished silver by cars. The cars are urns carrying ashes to the sea. In my initial reading of this poem, I noted that Route 80 is the straight line of superhighway that connects the metronormative centers of New York to San Francisco and that precludes any detours along the way. And my use of metronormative here draws from the work of Jack Halberstam, who coins it to name the hegemonic notion that queer life can only flourish in urban space, and that situates not all non-urban space as backward pre-political sites of homophobic violence. Ali's poem takes us off this metronormative grid. We journey through the byways and back roads off Route 80 that lead us into a different kind of queer territory. Here, the Ganges and Calcutta exist in the same temporal and geographic frame as the small towns of the US Midwest and the desert landscapes of Arizona. Ali's nostalgist map of America radically disaggregates the borders of the US nation. Instead, he evokes a queer regional imaginary that is both subnational and supranational simultaneously. The specificity of the US Southwest and the expansiveness of the Himalayas occupy the same poetic frame. Crucially, it is the queer body and queer relationality, the death of Ali's friend from AIDS, that conjure this palimpsestic landscape into existence. Indeed, the HIV-positive body, its blood, veins, and pain, its deterioration and its transformation, leaves an inescapable imprint on this landscape. The poem enacts what I call a queer optic, one through which we can see and sense the imbrication of various forms of erasure and dispossession that are typically obscured within dominant history. These violent erasures are precipitated by the AIDS epidemic, by militarized nationalisms in South Asia, and by the attempted genocide of indigenous peoples in the US Southwest. This capacious vision is in fact occasioned by queer forms of intimacy and friendship, love, and loss. Indeed, it is queer relationality that provides In Search of Evanescence with its connective thread. Many of the sections are addressed to you, Phil, the beloved friend who has disappeared from view. In the poem that precedes In Search of Evanescence, entitled A Nostalgist Map of America, Ali writes, I live in evanescence. I had to build it, for America was without one. End quote. To live in evanescence is to live at the vanishing point. It is to learn to dwell in a state of permanent temporariness, in a space unimaginable within a nationalist cartography. Evanescence is a kind of utopian non-space that cannot be captured or identified on any conventional map. Ali's evocation of evanescence echoes the ways in which queer subjects and queer scholars have theorized the fleeting, transitory nature of queer and racialized life worlds, particularly at the height of the AIDS epidemic of the 80s and 90s. José Muñoz, in an early essay from 1996 that laid the grounds of what we now call queer of color critique, eloquently theorizes queerness as ephemera. Muñoz writes, and this is from an essay entitled Ephemera as Evidence. I want to propose queerness as a possibility, a sense of self-knowing, a mode of sociality and relationality. Queerness is often transmitted covertly. This has everything to do with the fact that leaving too much of a trace has often meant that the queer subject has left herself open for attack. Instead of being clearly available as visible evidence, queerness has instead existed as innuendo, gossip, fleeting moments, and performances that are meant to be interacted with by those within its epistemological sphere, while evaporating at the touch of those who would eliminate queer possibility. For Muñoz, queer sociality, acts, and desires leaves traces that cannot be codified within standard metrics of evidence or contained within traditional archives. Instead, he suggests other means of archiving, seeing, feeling, sensing, and knowing queerness that subsequent generations of queer scholars, myself included, have taken to heart. What Ali gives us is precisely one method of archiving queer sociality and migrant existence through a poetic idiom. We can glimpse in Ali's roots to evanescence, queer life worlds and forms of sociality that are lost to history and that leave no trace except in the lyrical landscapes he creates. While Unruly Visions is centrally focused on visual art, my return to Ali in this talk is meant to remind us of the capacious quality of the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora. These practices can take any number of forms, from visual art to poetry to performance. In each instance, as we see in Ali's work, they enact a queer optic through which we can discern the outlines of a queer regional imaginary that produces region to region and diaspora to region connectivities that bypass the nation. This queer optic disarranges hetero and homonormative sightlines so that other bodies, landscapes, and affiliations come into view. So how does Ali's poetry give us an entry into another way of seeing the work of photographer Sunil Gupta, outside of the metronormative and homonormative lens through which I would say his work is often viewed? Ali's lyrical evocation of a queer regional imaginary brings to the fore a nuanced sense of queerness that is in fact available in Gupta's work. The 2011 monograph entitled Queer Sunil Gupta is a case in point. The book encapsulates Gupta's photographic work over 4 decades as he traces the vicissitudes of queer life in various cosmopolitan spaces: New York, London, Montreal, Paris, Delhi. Indeed, we can understand his work as a personal and collective archive of queer life worlds in multiple geographic locations. The book opens with his series, Christopher Street, New York, 1976. The series works within the genre of documentary photography to capture images of mostly white gay men in New York's West Village as they stride down city streets, confidently owning the public space of the city just prior to the AIDS epidemic that would devastate this community a few short years later. Gupta's photographic gaze in Christopher Street is that of an admiring voyeur. These images of men with tight jeans, aviator sunglasses, and handlebar mustaches are the objects of his desire. In an interview with Salim Kidwai included in the book, Gupta tellingly comments on the whiteness of the West Village gay scene that he was documenting. He observes that at that point in his own political formation, he was not thinking critically about how race and racism colored the gay scene that so enthralled him. But he nevertheless notes that he was more of an observer of, rather than a participant in, the hedonism of that time and space. Gupta's comments call to mind, for me, the words and images of Tungsan Tide, Marlon Riggs's groundbreaking 1989 autoethnographic documentary on Black gay life. Riggs, a contemporary of Gupta, recounts traveling from his small town in rural Georgia to the great gay Mecca, as he called it, of the Castro in San Francisco in the 1970s, only to be confronted with the pervasive racism of white gay male culture. This moment of pre-AIDS 1970s urban gay life in the West is all too easily mythologized and idealized within a gay male imagination as the apex of sexual freedom. In the very whiteness of the scenes he documents, Gupta captures its heady libidinal energy, but also hints at the shadow side of racial alienation and exclusion that haunt these metronormative gay centers. Significantly, in his book Queer, Gupta follows Christopher Street, New York, 1976, with a series Towards an Indian Gay Image, 1980 to 83. The series is made up of 4 black and white images set in Delhi that, like Christopher Street, portray presumably gay men in urban public space. The contrast between the 2 series is stark. Rather than the vibrant urban landscape of Christopher Street, where gay men matter-of-factly return or are indifferent to the camera's gaze. And Towards an Indian Gay Image, Gupta frames his subjects from the neck down or shoots them from the back as if to preserve their anonymity. The figures are singular or in pairs and are set against a backdrop of Delhi's most recognizable monuments, such as Humayun's tomb and the Qutb Minar. These settings suggest Gupta's desire to counter dominant Indian nationalist ideology that situates queerness outside the boundaries of the nation. The images indigenize queer life. They insist on the centrality of queerness to an Indian national imagination rather than acquiescing to the logic that situates queerness as its abject other. These photographs of men together in public space deliberately blur the boundary between documentary and stage photography, just as they capture the blurred boundaries between homosexuality and homoeroticism. The images suggest the ways in which queer men in India strategically exploit the slippage between the legislated homosexuality of everyday life, where same-sex physical intimacy is not necessarily a marker of non-normative sexual identity, and illicit homoeroticism, where homosexuality was, until 2018, criminalized under British colonial era laws. One could read the contrast between the sociality of queer public space in Christopher Street and the palpable feeling of singularity and loneliness in Towards an Indian Gay Image as highlighting Gupta's sense of the difficulties of living a visibly queer life in India in the 1980s. As is characteristic of much of his work, Gupta's images veer between documentary photography and stage tableau in a genre that he characterizes as figurative narrative. He further develops the genre in his related series, Exiles, Delhi, 1986 to 87, which again frames images of Indian men either alone or in pairs set against iconic national sites in Delhi, Humayun's tomb, India Gate, Lodi Gardens. As with Towards an Indian Gay Image, the series Exiles references not only Gupta's own diasporic status, but also the exilic nature of queerness in relation to the Indian nation. The images and accompanying text gleaned from interviews with men Gupta encountered in these spaces contradict this dominant nationalist logic by attesting to the fact that these spaces function simultaneously as sites of gay male cruising and sociality. The fragments of interviews also poignantly speak to the ambivalent effects of the invisibility of queer life and the lack of queer representation at this historical juncture in India. Gupta's later photographic series set in Delhi, Mr. Malhotra's Party, is not included in the book Queer, but provides an interesting counterpoint to the two earlier Delhi series. As Gupta comments on his website, quote, "In the 1980s, I made constructed documentary images of gay men in architectural spaces in Delhi, the Exiles series. Now people are meeting less in parks and more on the net in places like so-called private parties. I'm trying to visualize this latest virtual queer space by a series of portraits of real people who identify their sexuality as queer in some way. This time, they are willing to identify themselves. They're the guests of an imaginary party. I'm calling it Mr. Malhotra's Party," end quote. The large-scale color portraits in Mr. Malhotra's Party depict individuals typically centered in the frame, who gaze calmly and confidently into the camera against a backdrop of everyday street life in Delhi. Here, Gupta represents an uncompromising queer claiming of public space. It is more reminiscent of the street scenes of Christopher Street taken some 30 years earlier in New York, rather than the oblique glances and ambivalent gestures of Towards an Indian Gay Image or Exiles. Indeed, the resonances between Christopher Street and Mr. Malhotra's Party were made apparent when they were exhibited together at the SepiaEYE Gallery in New York in 2014 in a solo show entitled Sunil Gupta Out and About New York and Delhi. As one critic writes of this juxtaposition of the two series, quote, "Taken together, these photos speak to the variety of experiences in gay communities, but they also tell a story about the development of a photographer and activist. While he is an anonymous, wide-eyed observer in the village, Gupta shows himself to be an active dissenter in Delhi, driven to create a world in which, one day perhaps, images of gay life in the West and images of gay life in the East might not look so different," end quote. Such a reading is predicated on a teleological progress narrative that situates the global South in an anterior relation to the global North, where gay life in Delhi is only just catching up to gay life in New York as it was some 30 years ago. Furthermore, this reading, which I would argue is quite a common one in relation to Gupta's images, mobilizes a familiar set of binary oppositions between the West and the non-West, and charts a move very familiar to us from repression to liberation, invisibility to visibility, shame to pride. And of course, Layla was mentioning this in her introduction. Indeed, the very last photograph in the book Queer is a 2008 image from the very first Pride March in Delhi, where a smiling young man surrounded by rainbow flags holds aloft a sign that proclaims, "Proud to be gay." Thus, while the entire trajectory of the book Queer could be read as upholding a teleological vision of gay subjectivity, one that culminates in this image of gay pride and the triumphant collapse of the distinction between queer life here and there, now and then. In other words, it is an image of globalized queerness that is predicated on equivalence and sameness rather than difference and incommensurability. So this is what I've been alluding to earlier, that Gupta's work is often read into this teleological narrative of gay formation, especially when his images of India are juxtaposed with his images from the global North. But there is certainly another way to read Gupta's work outside of this gay progress narrative. I want to turn our attention to his 2011 work, Country, Portrait of an Indian Village. This is a series of about 25 color portraits of Mundia Pamar, his family's ancestral village in Uttar Pradesh, North India, taken over the course of 5 years. Interestingly, the series is not included in the book Queer, and at face value, this exclusion appears logical, as the series does not appear to be about queerness. These are scenes of everyday village life, far removed from the gay urban centers that are the focus of Queer. In Country, we find instead loving portraits of the village's inhabitants, interspersed with images of a rural landscape of color, light, and shade. The series initially appears incidental, an odd anomaly in relation to the rest of Gupta's oeuvre. But this work signifies quite differently if we situate it in relation to the poetry of Agha Shahid Ali. Bringing Ali's evocation of a queer regional imaginary into the frame of Gupta's Country allows us to situate and make sense of Country in the context of the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora. Such a framing reveals that Gupta here, like Ali, deploys a queer regional imaginary that displaces the primacy of heteronormative gay narratives. Indeed, it is precisely because these images do not announce themselves as queer or as about queerness in any obvious sense that I find them so compelling. They suggest an alternative modality of framing queerness outside the binary oppositions and progress narratives of visibility and coming out, which characterize standard tellings of queer subject formation and through which Gupta's work can be interpreted. On his website, Gupta writes of Country as follows, quote, Mundia Parmar is a small village about 17 kilometers north of the district town of Shah Jahanpur in the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh. My father was born and brought up in this village, although he was sent to school and the military and never really returned to live. I was born in Delhi, and so this ancestral landscape became a legendary place that we really only visited annually for Holi. As immigrants in the West, this landscape assumed mythical proportions. Over the years, I photographed it sporadically as part of my family album. Now that my father has died, I've become intensely interested in how the family is organized and its relationship to the land, its sexuality, and its own feudal history. I realize that the Indian village is no longer fashionable. But for me, it's part of a lifelong interest in the family album and the construction of gender and sexuality within it, and the outward expression of these issues as property and inheritance, end quote. Gupta undercuts a reading of the images as transparently ethnographic through his use of the diptych. This is a format that recurs throughout much of his oeuvre, where he deploys it to suggest unexpected resonances between seemingly incommensurate objects or geographic spaces. In Country, he utilizes the diptych to pair a self-portrait set against the backdrop of wheat fields with an image of a broken colonial-era foundation stone that reads in part, Clark Sugar Factory, Mundia Parmar, established 1926. This pairing makes evident the ways in which Country functions as a genealogical project in Foucault's sense of the term, where genealogy implies a sense of history marked not by linearity and origins, but rather by digressions, ruptures, and ellipses. Gupta's queer genealogy runs not through the nation, but through the region. In so doing, it maps a diaspora region axis rather than the diaspora nation axis that is evident in his earlier series, like Towards an Indian Gay Image or Exiles. Indeed, if we read Country as a family album, as Gupta suggests that we do, we can understand it as a queer archival excavation of his own familial history, as well as of a collective regional history. In Gupta's queer regional imaginary, he situates his own diasporic queer subject formation in the context of the region's imbrication within global circuits of colonial power. Sugar, of course, is the colonial commodity par excellence and links Mundia Parmar to far-flung sites throughout the British Empire. Gupta's image thus speaks to what Lisa Lowe terms the intimacies of 4 continents, the legacies of colonial labor relations and commodity exchange that tie Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas to each other. In an interview, Gupta comments that, quote, "My family was quite divided. Half of it was working with the British and set up sugar factories with their help, and the other half fought the British," end quote. Gupta thus traces his own queer genealogy through these complex histories of class, caste, and patriarchal privilege and colonial power relations. Country serves as an interesting counterpoint to the other explicitly autobiographical works in Gupta's oeuvre. He often inserts his own body into the frame, most strikingly in the earlier series, From Here to Eternity, created in the wake of his HIV-positive diagnosis in 1995. Gupta also utilizes the diptych here, starkly juxtaposing images of his own medicalized body with those of shuttered entries to gay sex clubs and bathhouses in London. Shorn of their seedy glamour in the light of day, these spaces appear desolate and unremarkable. The diptych format here connotes both proximity and distance between the apparently discrete objects on either side of the frame. In his commentary on this series, Gupta writes that his diagnosis propelled him into cycles of illness and depression, accompanied by, as he puts it, an overwhelming sense of social exclusion. From Here to Eternity is, in a sense, Gupta's nostalgist map of gay urban geography, to riff off Ali's phrase. The locked doors and deserted spaces connote the memory of queer sex and sociality that feel increasingly remote and inaccessible, and that vanish from the historical record. In Country, Gupta inserts his own HIV-positive body into the village landscape. His body carries with it all the other spaces of belonging and unbelonging it has traversed, and that give it meaning and context. I read Gupta here to be in conversation with Ali's poetry, where, as we saw, the queer body and queer relationality bring a palimpsestic landscape into focus. Similarly, in Gupta's work, it is his own queer HIV-positive body that provides the connective element that links Mundya Parmar to London's gay urban geography. While these sites seem to have nothing to do with one another, they are intimately linked within Gupta's own genealogy of queer formation. Another diptych in Country is comprised of a close-up portrait of what appears to be a gender non-conforming figure, whose short hair and face stubble contrast with their sari, bindi, and smeared red lipstick. Gupta has noted that this figure is in fact a reveler at a holy celebration, one of the many religious, regional, and theatrical practices in India that allow for gender play and sexual license. Regardless of whether the viewer reads this figure as a gender non-conforming individual or as simply a participant in a socially sanctioned performance of gender and sexual alterity, the image gains a particular valence when viewed in the context of Gupta's oeuvre. In Country, this image is paired with that of a middle-aged man proudly displaying a framed black and white photograph, possibly a colonial era portrait of British and Indian officers or administrators, perhaps of the very sugar factory where Gupta's family was involved. This pairing of images makes clear the ways in which queerness, here in the form of gender nonconformity, is intrinsic to the texture of everyday life in the most non-metropolitan of spaces. These spaces are simultaneously marked by long histories of colonial power and globalization. Thus, Gupta produces a regional archive that is also simultaneously a queer archive, one that situates his own diasporic queerness in relation to those forms of non-normative sexualities and embodiments that mark the space of the region. These modalities of queerness are unintelligible within a metronormative gay vision and imagination. Christopher Street and Country were exhibited together at a 2015 group show at the Philadelphia Museum of Art entitled Picture This, India Through Contemporary Photography. As one critic wrote of the show, quote, "While the two series depict wildly different scenarios, both are indicative of Gupta's search for a community to which he can truly belong," end quote. Indeed, as we see in From Here to Eternity, which is the series that foregrounds his own HIV-positive body, through Gupta's lens, sites of queer belonging are also simultaneously spaces of unbelonging and alienation, and are crisscrossed with complex relays of power and privilege. Crucially, Country interrupts the metronormative gay vision of Christopher Street by calling forth gendered embodiments and desires that cannot easily be folded back into a telos of gay subject formation. Unlike Mr. Malhotra's party, which when paired with Christopher Street can be read as its belated equivalent, Country insists on the non-equivalence and incommensurability of these locations. If we read Gupta's work through the framing afforded to us by the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora, we can see that Mundia Parmar is not the absolute abject other to Christopher Street. It is not the anachronistic, traditional rural space in the global South that stands in opposition to the modern urban ideal of queer life in the global North. Rather, we can understand both Mundia Parmar and Christopher Street as mythic terrains that are central to Gupta's queer genealogical project. Not only is his own queer subjectivity deeply informed by both locations, but Country interrupts an easy valorization of all that Christopher Street represents by summoning forth a queer regional imagination. In so doing, Country demands that we look beyond the most obvious signposts and markers of gay visibility and liberation in our framing and understanding of queerness. So to conclude, I hope that my act of queer curation in juxtaposing Ali and Gupta has allowed us to see both their works anew. For Ali, to frame his work in relation to Gupta's is to lay bare the centrality of queer intimacy to the layered landscapes he so lyrically evokes. For Gupta, to frame his work in relation to Ali's is to dislodge any easy recuperation into standard narratives of gay visibility. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, this pairing of Ali and Gupta also prompts us to reframe the parameters of both diaspora and queerness. In relation to diaspora, their work functions along a diaspora region or region to region axis, rather than the diaspora nation axis that is the typical orientations of standard articulations of diaspora. The queer regional imaginaries that their work evokes displace and repudiate the primacy of the nation form and its killing logics of exclusion and occupation, dispossession and expulsion. And of course, we see this so clearly in what is taking place in Kashmir at this very moment. Their work is resolutely anti-national. They embrace this moniker that is currently being used as a slur in India to silence dissent. To my mind, their work takes on renewed urgency given this moment of entrenched right-wing nationalism that we see across India, Europe, and the US. Their work also demands that we understand queerness to reference not only non-conforming bodies and desires. Just as importantly, queerness functions as an alternative optic through which to apprehend time, space, and relationality. But at the same time, what emerges in their work are not disembodied landscapes. The pairing of Gupta and Ali insists on the materiality of the queer body as a site through which we can access these more capacious modes of seeing and sensing the intimacies of disparate histories and social formations. The final point I want to stress is that the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora reveal how all spaces of home and dwelling are shot through with contradictions and fissures, that there is no going back, no return to an unsullied past, no secure space of safety. In light of this knowledge, these aesthetic practices suggest that those who are subjected to various regimes of power nevertheless find viable and indeed pleasurable ways to live in evanescence, so to speak, to live in the wake of violence and uncertainty, dispossession, and displacement. In this sense, the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora are indeed modes of emplacement. They rearrange and emplace us as readers and viewers in a different relation to history and memory. They bring into the realm of the present those traces of other times and spaces that provide the occasion for a different sense of possibility and horizon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gayatri. I had a series of questions numbered in order that I wanted to ask you, and they're all scrambled now as you were talking. I was sort of thinking it's probably highly appropriate against the telos. So that was a real taste, I think, in that presentation for your practice of queer curation, a lot of food for thought there. And that was the first thing I wanted to ask you a bit more about, actually, this idea of curation, because I think you use it in quite a different way to scholars such as Cristina Rivera Garza, a lot of other scholars who've used this term. And there's been this sort of going back to the etymology of curation, curare, kind of taking care of, but also healing. And some people have read this as a sort of emphasis on reconciliation and attentiveness to wholeness. Whereas I think you take curation in a different way, with more of this attention to taking care. And I just wondered, could you talk a little bit more about that, about how you conceive of that term?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I do talk about the etymology of the word and curare and to care for. And for me, you know, the caring is not about healing in the sense of coming into any kind of whole subjectivity, which is impossible. And that's why I sort of, you know, my first book is called Impossible Desires, and I hold on to that sense of impossibility. And that's why I ended this talk with that sense of no possibility of going back, right? No possibility of true recuperation. So I'm definitely not invested in curation as a method of healing. And instead, what I'm trying to do in juxtaposing these sort of dissimilar forms, artists that seem to be from radically dissimilar sites, right, and working in very dissimilar ways, is to actually sort of foreground rupture and dissonance and fragmentariness. And, you know, I think it's in that context of the rupture, of the dissimilitude, right, of the incommensurability, that new meanings come to light. And so that's the work of queer curation that I'm trying to do in the book. And, you know, there's a chapter in the book where I put Akram Zathari, who's a queer Lebanese artist, in conversation with Alan D'Souza, who's a Goan Kenyan artist, and Saidiya Hartman. And so, you know, those aren't obvious pairings, you know, but I think it gives new meaning to each of their works by putting them in conversation in that way.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that really comes through in your work. And you also bring in ideas of, you know, genealogies, palimpsest, fragmentation, elision, rupture, etc., drawing on Foucault. So I was just wondering then, in this sort of radical openness in your own migration around disciplines, because you, of course, as an undergraduate, started in Latin American studies, the field that I work in. I just wondered how we can avoid the sort of idea of the kind of imperial queer, like how did this queer kind of radical openness and expansiveness, how do we avoid that sort of applicate that this idea of applying concepts to contexts where they may not have been welcome? Have you come across that in your work? And also the idea of radical expansiveness. I know this is not the way that you're using it, although you are very attentive to the transnational and the potential neoliberal sort of appropriations of this freedom, access all areas. Have you ever sort of encountered resistance to the use of the term queer in the global South? Or what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of gets at the heart of all my work in some ways. You know, what I was trying to do in the first book is really think about what does queerness look like in these other sites, you know, outside of the global North, but also within immigrant communities in the global North. And so the ways in which queerness is constantly being ruptured, you know, through race, through migration, through histories of colonialism, you know, through the specifics and particularities of these different historical formations. So, you know, in some ways, I'm still holding on to queer as a kind of shorthand to reference the particularities, you know. And so this is also why I'm interested in this idea of the region in some ways. And, you know, Sunil Gupta's, you know, that series, Country, is so fascinating to me, you know, because like I said before, it doesn't seem to be queer, you know. But then when you look at it in the kind of lens that I'm looking at it in, and Gupta's own sort of reading of the work, right, where he says, you know, he goes back to this space and he's thinking about the sexual logics embedded in it, you know, so there's a way in which he's reading sexuality into this space as well. So on the one hand, it could be seen as a kind of imperial gesture, as you're saying, to think about queerness in relation to that site. But I think the way I'm looking at it is really kind of taking my lead from the artist himself, you know, to think about, you know, what does non-normative sexuality, non-conforming desires, and embodiments look like in these other spaces, right? And how can we be really attuned to them without sort of homogenizing them? And and so I think that's you know, that's the project of queer diaspora in so many ways, is to keep the particularities in play, even as we're putting these sites in conversation.
Okay, yeah, I think that leads on to another thing I wanted to ask you about sort of your idea of kind of queer optic versus the idea of very explicitly in certain modes of legibility kind of queer content. And because we spoke a little bit before about how you don't want to lose sight of the materiality of the queer body. So in emphasizing a queer way of reading, a queer way of seeing, what danger is there or potential is there in overlooking the kind of materiality of the queer body? Because country is an anomaly, as you've pointed out in Gupta's work, in that it isn't necessarily very physically queer.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that I see my students struggle with as well, you know, the ways in which we're you know, in my first book, I was talking about queer diaspora as a kind of critical hermeneutic, you know, and in this book, I'm talking about a queer optic as a mode of seeing that allows us to get at what can't be seen through sort of normative history. So yes, it's a method, right? And at the same time, you know, the danger then is that queerness sort of loses meaning. You know, you can sort of queer everything. And so what I try and do in the book is as you say so well, actually, you know, I try and hold on to the materiality of queer communities, queer culture, queer bodies, even as I'm using queer and deploying queer as a method, as a way of seeing. And I think that's always a kind of tension, you know, that's at work. And I think that's why, you know, I was so drawn to, you know, this is what I was trying to do in my reading of Ali, because, you know, let me just say, most of the, you know, he's really quite a canonical poet, right? I mean, there's a lot of work written on him, and the vast majority of it really does not engage with the question of queerness at all, you know? So, you know, his queerness is, you know, his sort of personal life is seen as sort of separate from his poetry, and his poetry is seen as simply engaging questions of exile, migration, Kashmir, loss, longing. And so, you know, when you actually look at the work through this kind of queer optic, you see that queer bodies are actually all over that text, those texts, right? Those poems. So it's not just queer bodies, but it's queer relationality that actually allows the poem to even come together. And so, you know, I think that sort of encapsulates the ways in which I'm sort of enacting a kind of queer reading, but I'm also trying to be attentive to the moments of queer relationality, queer, you know, affinity, queer desire, queer materiality that's also embedded in these texts. And I think that's sort of the struggle that we engage in as queer scholars in some ways.
Yeah, I think that idea of going back and reading things that, or looking at things that you've looked at before in a new light, and your sort of openness to that, and a resistance to a teleological approach to your own research process is really interesting. You say in some ways you hadn't seen Gupta as part of your project, and then, you know, partly through reading Ali, you kind of went back, and it takes a sort of real humility, I think, that really comes through in how you talk about your work, to think, actually, have I is there something that I haven't seen here? Could you talk a little bit more about that, how that kind of came about?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that's what I was trying to say early on in telling you like how this project came about in the first place, you know, because Unruly Visions was already in press when I was asked by Gayatri Sinha to write on Sunil Gupta. And I thought, you know, this is so curious. I've actually never written on Gupta, even though, of course, he's like an obvious person for me to write about. And part of it is that, you know, my first book in particular was really focused on articulating, you know, female homoeroticism, queer female desire, and thinking about that as the kind of constitutive absence in so many different discourses, you know? Mm-hmm. And so Gupta seemed to me to be photographing predominantly or interested in sort of excavating gay male desire in these cosmopolitan spaces. And so it seemed to be fitting within a kind of visibility politics that I was actually trying to work against in Impossible Desires, where, you know, I showed you that little, the cover of that book, you know, which is all about like the unspoken, right? The modes of desire that don't articulate themselves as queer in any obvious sense, but that nevertheless exist in the interstices of heterosexuality and heteronormativity. And that's what I wanted to pull out. So Gupta in some ways, in making queerness so visible, and that's obviously a necessary project, but it wasn't my project, you know? Mm-hmm. And so as you're saying, you know, it was going back to the work and being forced to look at it much more carefully. And then at the same time thinking about Ali and rethinking about, you know, what Ali meant at this moment of Indian occupation in Kashmir. So rethinking about that work and then putting those in conjunction, it came to this other point. So I think it also speaks to like how we come to our work, you know, how do we write, you know, what prompts us to write what we write? And in some ways it's happenstance, you know. We're responding to historical moments, we're responding to sort of external, you know, demands. But then it, as you're saying, it really made me rethink my initial sort of putting aside of Gupta. I mean, and I'm thinking, actually, you know, you're talking about a mode of critical humility. I think we all have to have that, and I certainly do in relation to this work. But, you know, I'm thinking of Cabana Mercer and Robert Mapplethorpe, and do you remember that early piece that he wrote where he had to rethink his initial dismissal of Mapplethorpe, you know? And so I think we have models within queer scholarship of doing that, right?
Yes, and Gupta himself also talks about his sort of belatedness in arriving to issues of race. And he talks about how for him kind of queerness took priority over issues of race and racialization, and talks about this sort of primacy of the queer. And that was something else I wanted to ask you about, because I know you very much see your work as being in the field of gender and sexuality, very much in dialogue with lots of queer of colour scholarship. But I was just wondering, and you often have this idea of the sort of genealogy of queer theory kind of being the sort of white kind of white queer theory, and then this, yeah, sort of seeing how it's kind of adapted. You know, lots of scholars have written on this. Michael Hames-Garcia, lots of scholars have criticised this. And I was just sort of wondering, about this idea of the temporality of queer theory and how much the word queer contributes to that. And do you have any reflections on that?
Well, I mean, let me just quickly, you know, you had mentioned the, you know, Gupta's own belatedness in relation to thinking about race. And, you know, I was really struck by that when I was looking at the Christopher Street images, because, you know, he says he wasn't thinking about race in relation to those images, right? I mean, for him, it was like, you know, taking the photograph was a way of cruising, right? I mean, it was him sort of, you know, enacting his own desire, right? And it was only later, a few years later, I think it was when he came back to London, that he was really thinking about race in more, you know, sort of critical ways. But at the same time, you know, this is, I think, the work that we do as critics, because when I look at those images, right, I'm putting it in conversation with something like Marlon Riggs, right? And his, you know, in Tongues Untied, he has that scene where he's entering into the Castro and reflecting on his own unwantedness in that space of white gay male racism, right? And so, you know, this I think is how works gain meaning, right? Like I, as a critic, am looking at those Christopher Street images, putting it in conversation with Marlon Riggs, and reading race and racism into those images in a way that Gupta may not have himself, you know? And so anyway, that's something I wanted to say, that that's a kind of queer of color work that I'm doing in relation to those images, right?
Yeah.
But then, you know, your larger question was about, I think the trajectory of queerness, the genealogy of queer.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I mean, I'll just say that, you know, I was doing this work, you know, I was writing my dissertation like 20 years ago now, and I was very much in conversation with, you know, certainly folks like José Muñoz, but then there were all these other sort of fellow travelers in queer of color scholarship. I'm thinking of Martin Manalansan's work in queer diaspora scholarship, David Eng, and others that I was absolutely drawing on. So I felt like it was part of this kind of collective project that we were all part of, to really articulate the ways in which, you know, race, sexuality, and migration were so deeply imbricated in the way that we didn't really see, you know, in sort of existing queer scholarship. But, you know, at the same time, I'm, you know, Unruly Visions and my whole thinking around archives and affect is very indebted to the work of somebody like Anne Stekovich and, you know, other queer scholars who are maybe one generation ahead of me, you know. And so I really appreciated, Natasha, what you said about, I was really moved by what you said about like my work sort of enabling other work that's come after mine, you know. And I guess I'm also always thinking of how I got to where I got to, you know, what enables my work to emerge. And so, you know, I'm thinking of the sort of scholars that came before me, not just in queer studies, but also folks like Lisa Lowe, whose work I'm really indebted to, and also Black British cultural studies. I mean, I should say that, like, my first book was really indebted to Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy and Isaac Julian and Cabana Mercer. I mean, that's where I saw diaspora being really articulated in ways that were useful for me, you know?
Yeah, and I suppose this is one of the things about queer studies, this kind of trying not to be, as many scholars have said, trying not to be disciplined by disciplines. And you said before, you know, about kind of letting the questions lead you. And yeah, I've got a few questions starting to come in. If anyone wants to ask a question, do use the raise hand function on Zoom that appears when you click the participant list. I've got some questions from people watching on YouTube that I'll come to, but just one thing before that, could you just talk a little bit about your own sort of queer migration around through sort of area studies into kind of gender and sexuality studies, because I'm really interested in this, how you started in Latin American.
Yeah. So my my undergraduate degree was in Latin American studies, and Natasha, I was saying to you yesterday when we spoke that it came out of a real desire to understand the workings of colonialism, the afterlives of colonialism, and I also, you know, it's important to say that, you know, at that moment in the late 80s, there was a lot of activism in the US around US occupation in Latin America and Central America in particular. So I came at it through a kind of activist lens and also through kind of a love of the literature, right? And so that was my way. And then when it came time for graduate school, I really was grappling with how to put together my love and interest in Latin American studies with thinking about South Asian studies. And at that point, you know, these area studies fields seemed so separate that there was no way for me to actually put those together, because, you know, I was interested broadly in thinking about the Americas, but I was also interested in post-colonial studies. And somehow, you know, when I was at Columbia in the early 90s, mid 90s, you know, you had to absolutely define yourself as doing British or doing American, right? This was in the literature, in the English department. And there was no way to imagine that you could sort of do both. And so for me, gender and sexuality studies was actually the kind of home I found, where I didn't have to sort of define myself through these area studies modes. And that allowed me to, as you say, like let the questions dictate where I go, rather than my discipline or, you know, a sense of area. So this book, Unruly Visions, is actually really critical of area studies. And what I'm trying to do is sort of push against an area studies frame through queer studies, sort of using queer studies to push against area studies. So, I mean, I think now, 20 years later, there's much more porousness, you know, in terms of the fields, in terms of what you can do in an English department. But you know, I mean, I'm in a department called Social and Cultural Analysis. It's really a cultural studies department. It's not an English department. I think that's significant. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think your theorization, the idea of sort of thinking through the region is really key to this. There are some sort of things that you comment on that have shifted, whereas it's you that's been part of doing the shifting. So I think that's sort of key to emphasize. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because you use region both as sort of sub and supranational.
Yeah.
But you tend to work, just thinking about the languages of the works that you work in, etc. And whether you've ever felt kind of, whether you've been drawn to learning certain regional languages, even like trying to resist the sort of Anglophone dominance in queer studies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's also I mean, this is where, you know, area studies knowledge formation is useful, right? In terms of language, right? And so this is where I fall short, because I know Spanish, you know, but I you know, when I'm talking about Akram Zathari's work, you know, I don't speak Arabic, you know, I'm not, so there's so much that I don't know, you know. And I think, again, this kind of humility is really necessary. So on the one hand, I am sort of delving into areas like Middle East studies, right, and visual art, where I actually don't have an expertise, and I'm very conscious of that, you know. And so I try to be very careful to acknowledge that, you know. And I think this is sort of the danger, but the necessity in some ways when we're working outside of these strict area studies frames is, you know, how can we sort of be very conscious of not, you know, be very conscious of what we don't know, you know, but at the same time, not allow that that ignorance, right, to keep us from actually putting these objects in relation to one another and seeing what emerges from that. And so what I try and do, like my workaround, you know, because I'm not trained in, say, Middle East studies. So when I'm looking at Akram Zathari's work, for instance, what I try and do is be extremely attentive to the work itself, and to start from the artwork and then allow the theorization to emerge from that. So to deeply contextualize it, to historicize it. And that, you know, that's going back to what you asked about queer curation, you know, and the care. I mean, that's where I see the care work happen, is in how careful you are, how attentive you are to the object itself.
Yeah, and it's very, it really does come across in your writing. I've got a few questions come through from YouTube. So I think, yeah, we have to keep in mind, obviously we have people from lots of different disciplines here. So someone's asking on YouTube, what do you think queer and trans migration aesthetics can teach us about research on law and activism, or the limits thereof, and vice versa? So I suppose the dialogue between law, activism, social sciences, and then I'll work more in kind of aesthetic and cultural analysis.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I was struck by
I really commend the organizers for making this such an interdisciplinary conference. And so, you know, I appreciate I think one of the first panels is on the law. So I'm really interested to think about that. You know, I think that's a great question. You know, what's the relation between aesthetics and the law, and how can we think of, you know, what I'm saying in relation to a kind of critique of visibility politics that emerges in Sunil's work, that emerges in Agha Shahid's work, and how do we apply it to the legal arena, which I think is necessarily invested in a kind of visibility politics, right? I mean, so, you know, you know, I keep thinking of Spivak's framing of rights being that which we cannot not want, right? And so when we're working within the framework of rights, obviously there's a kind of visibility politics that is necessary there. But I think what the aesthetic can offer us is understanding the ways in which the law, you know, may in fact codify and congeal identity in a way that actually does kind of an inadvertent violence to other modes of being, you know. So I think the thing is to work within the categories that the law gives us, but to always recognize, you know, what may be falling out, what may actually be effaced, and what may be rendered sort of impossible within that framing. So they're both, you know, the aesthetic and the legal, they're so necessary, but they can also be quite dissonant. And I think that dissonance is actually important, you know? So, but I appreciate that question.
Thank you. Thanks for that response. I was at a book launch recently that was attentive to kind of legal and social questions. It was called there's a book with UCL Press that came out called The Tenacity of the Couple Norm, and it was about sort of ways of being, ways of living that were either kind of forced to being in certain ways because of the law or because of kind of legal frameworks or sort of overlooked, and in the context of the pandemic and ideas of home and household, etc., how certain ways of being and relationality are sort of overlooked. But yeah, thank you for that.
Exactly.
I've got another question. I think you can probably see this one actually. Yeah, so it's also from Ashleo about legality. How would you respond to questions of legality when it comes to queer liberation without affirming binary narratives of oppression and liberation? So how, I suppose it's a follow-on question in a way. Yeah, how is the legal framework capable of holding on to the sort of nuance? We've talked about the difficulty doing this in our own scholarship. How do you bring a book together without making things cohere, without creating a kind of coherent narrative? How do you hold on to fragmentation when you're sort of bringing things together?
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, I think this is where the aesthetic is really important, because, you know, what I've been trying to do in both books is point to, you know, modes of queerness that, as I said before, don't announce themselves as queer in any obvious sense. And, you know, I think, you know, the law, you know, demands that we understand gay, lesbian in these very particular congealed, solidified ways. And, you know, in some ways I keep coming back to Foucault and the idea of visibility being a trap, or Glissant talking about the right to opacity, right? The right to not be seen. And so I think, you know, this is why questions of aesthetics and representation are so interesting to me, because, you know, I think what these artists are doing they're working within the visual register and nevertheless pushing against the demand, you know, to be visible in these legible ways that the law demands, right? Not just the law, but the state and all these other ways in which we are enjoined to articulate our rights. And so, you know, I think the work of the aesthetic is to say, you know, let's actually think of much more capacious ways in which queerness operates in which we live our lives, right? So that's sort of my sort of follow-up response to that question about the law.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, maybe one final question that I've got here again from YouTube. So this is someone who's specifically working on Sunil Gupta in their dissertation, and they're wondering how works like Sun City might fit with this reading that you've offered of his work. It's quite a specific question.
You know, I'm not familiar with that work. I know the title, but it's not coming to mind. Can the viewer say a little bit more? Or
whoever's out there on YouTube, can you say a bit more? Is it sort of like an anomaly in a way, like country? Could you sort of describe the general approach in Sun City, and then we'll come back to that. And it was glissant, the right to. Oh, sorry. Someone's asking a question here in the multitasking here. Yeah, so let's just see if that follow-up comes through the YouTube, because I can't see that directly. Nikki might post. So okay. Okay, so just a question. We're probably going to have to wrap up soon, but there's a question on curation returning to the material. So curation in museums. And how queer curation, I suppose, might be brought into practice in that context. So it says, I guess you can see that. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about queer curation and understanding curation in relation to museums that are in so many ways built on colonial extractive practices that continue to function now through the knowledge production industry today. Would queer be situated in radical difference from curation then?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, in some ways, I know there are curators on this call, I'm sure, you know, who are listening. And so I'm really curious, you know, to know how folks who are actually, you know, curators working in galleries and museums are actually thinking about how to dislodge how to really decolonize the museum. And that work is absolutely being done. I think, and so I really appreciate the work that's being done out there around that. And I do think that, you know, we can use queerness as a kind of method for, you know, actually showing work, you know, in a different way. I think for me, you know, I was really thinking about the work that we do as critics as a mode of curation. You know, and that's what I was trying to get at, that, you know, and it was helpful for me to think about the work that I do as a scholar, you know, on the written page as a mode of curation, right? Yeah. That we're sort of putting these objects in relation in order for these kind of other meanings to emerge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that I keep on thinking there's only one more question, so we'll keep on going. But I think we are coming to we have come to 1:30 now. There are a few other questions here.
Let's just take one more question, if that's okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, let's do one more then. So to sort of take it in order that they came in. So we've got Susanna Mushtaq, who's asked, as Kashmiris, we've always read Agha Shahid work as separate from his queerness. And as a queer scholar now, I see your point. I see queerness intertwined in his poems. My question to you is, why do you think most of the scholarship on his work separates it from queerness? And what prompted you to apply queer reading? And I think you sort of said what prompted.
Thank you so much for that question. I mean, honestly, I think there are multiple reasons, I think, why folks haven't engaged with queerness in relation to his work. The first is that the work itself, again, it doesn't obviously read as queer, right? In the sense that it's not obviously talking about same-sex eroticism or desire. And so in that sense, you know, it's very easy, you know, within a kind of heteronormative imagination to imagine that there is no queerness there, right? And so it comes from, I think, critics who are so focused on the questions of exile, migration, loss in his work, and don't see that as related in any way to sexuality, to not even think queerness as sort of being embedded in the work in some ways. So I think that's one question, one response.
Mm-hmm.
And was there another? What prompted me to apply the queer reading to his work? You know, in some ways, I was always, you know, in some ways, he always interested me because I knew anecdotally, in some ways, that he himself was queer, right? And so this is coming back to the kind of tension between queerness as a sort of method and then queer as kind of this lived experience. And so I knew that anecdotally, and I never got to know him. And I know probably some folks on this call may have known him, but I never got to know him. But I did know that about him. And I was so curious, you know, where is the queerness in the work? Does it emerge in some way? And so that's what sort of got me interested in sort of reading his work in that way. And then, of course, when you look at it, it's not just the way in which he evokes his dead friend. It's that you know, it's HIV, it's the epidemic, it's sort of giving the kind of connective through line to that poem, right? That wouldn't exist otherwise. And so that was my point, is that we can't actually understand that poem without thinking about queer relationality, queer affect, queer loss, right? That's what sort of provides the poem with its connective thread. The other thing I'll say, just in terms of Ali, is that, you know, he has this deep identification to these you know, North Indian, you know, musical icons like Begum Akhtar, right? And so, you know, her work, Hindustani, you know, classical music, and particularly that figure of Begum Akhtar, is everywhere in that work. So there's this kind of deep identification with these female figures. That is a kind of queer, you know, gay male sort of fandom that I see at work there, you know, and not just to Begum Akhtar, but also to Emily Dickinson. So this is a whole part of the paper I didn't get to, but, you know, In Search of Evanescence is really an homage to Dickinson. And so he has these sort of, you know, I would say it's this kind of gay male fandom of these like female artists and female figures that's also really embedded in the work. So the queerness is very much there if you know how to look for it.
Yeah, with the queer optic.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much. You've been so generous already with your time. So what we'll do is we'll send you the other questions afterwards from Sarah, Ellen, Lorenzo, so you can contact those people directly. But just thank you so much. It's been an amazing start to the conference, and to all the attendees. Remember, we have the events over the rest of this week.
I just want to say thank you, Natasha. It's been such a joy to get to know you and to be in conversation with you. And, you know, your generosity in terms of your questions has just been really lovely. So thank you so much for that. It's
really my pleasure, and such a privilege for me. Anyway, thank you all for being here.
It's so much.
Brighten my lot down.
See you
Take
soon.
care. Take care all.